Lord Buddha had been traveling for many months, and everywhere he went, people would seek him out wanting answers to their problems. Being generous natured and hearted, he gave them answers that they wanted, but all they did was take from him. So he was weary, he was footsore, and he was tired. And he wanted to look for somewhere where he could spend some time to rest, to be still, and to regain that sense of self. And he came across a small village that nestled in the curve of a lake of cool, still, crystal clear waters, fringed by pine forest and mountains. Lord Buddha made his way down through the village to the lake, to the shoreline where he stood. And he looked deep down into the lake, and he could see right to the bottom because the water was so clear and it was so still. He closed his eyes and he took in the air, which was scented heavily. It was pungent and spicy with pine. Yes, this would be the place. So he took up residence in a small hut that had been kindly donated by a villager. And there, over time, he rested. He was still, and he slowly regained that sense of self. In the same village, there was a woman, recently bereaved. She'd lost her only little boy, a lively, bright child, the only thing that remained from her happy marriage to her late husband. But when he had passed, her whole world had turned inwards and had focused on that child. He became her life. He became her future. He became her joy. And the first step he took, and when he first said mama and looked at her with love in his eyes, it was in those moments that she felt that pang, that she wanted to share her joy with her husband. But her little boy was her world, and she couldn't see anything, her future ahead without him. And one day, he took ill with fever and went to bed. She was frantic and stayed up all night, cradling him in her arms, soothing his feverish, restless little body with cooling waters, praying from the bottom of her soul for him to survive, for him to live. She did not know what she could do without him. But in the early hours of the next morning, he shuddered in her body and her arms. He took his last breath, and his spirit passed from this world into the next. Her whole world collapsed around her. She held on to him, and she wailed, and she cried, and she sobbed. She could not see her future without him. For her, she had no life now. And her family and friends circled around her, offering her condolences and love, and offering to help her with his funeral. She said, no, holding on to him. And then a relative whispered in her ear, Lord Buddha is in the village. Go and ask him for help. And that little flicker of hope began to burn once more within her. And with her cradling her little boy's lifeless body, she went to the hut where Lord Buddha was living. She ducked under the low entrance as she entered and found Lord Buddha sitting in the darkness. He lit a lamp and beckoned her to come and sit opposite him, which she did. She knelt down and laid out the body of her little boy in front of him. She bowed and then sat up. She looked into Lord Buddha's eyes and said, Lord, please help me. My little boy, he's all I have left. I cannot see my way forward without him. I have no life. And Lord Buddha saw in her eyes the suffering, sorrow. He saw her body weighed down with grief, and he was moved. And he said, I will help you, but you must bring me mustard seeds. And when he saw that flicker of hope in her eyes, he held up his hand and said, they must be mustard seeds that come from a household where no one has been touched by death. If you can do that, I will make a medicine and give your little boy back the gift of life. She rose to her feet. Certainly this was not a hard task. She thanked Lord Buddha, and she left the hut, leaving her little boy in the care of the Buddha. And then she began to go around all the houses of the village, knocking on all the doors. And as each one opened, people inside knew her story. They pitied her, and they wanted to help her as much as they could. So when she asked them, did they have mustard seeds? They said, oh, yes, we have lots of mustard seeds. We can give those to you. But it was the second part of her request that made them hesitate. At one house, a man said, I lost my wife 6 weeks ago. At another, a woman said, my son 7 years ago. At another, a young woman, my father 6 months ago. Each door she knocked on of all the houses in that village, she found that everyone, yes, they had mustard seeds, but they'd all been touched by death. So when the door at the last house closed behind her, she knew it was hopeless. She felt that her heart grow heavy again. She felt those barbs of grief begin to prick and gnaw within her. And she made her way back to the hut where Lord Buddha was. She ducked under the low entrance as she entered. She went and took her place opposite Lord Buddha. She knelt down. She said, it's hopeless. I couldn't do what you asked of me. I cannot see a future ahead without him. And Lord Buddha, oh, he was moved. He had compassion and pity. He got up from where he was sitting. He made his way over to where she was kneeling. And he knelt down in front of her. He took her face in his hands, and he looked into her eyes, into her soul, into her suffering. And he said, in this life we live, we share birth, life, and death. But it is up to each and every one of us how we learn to live with our grief. And as he spoke, she felt her body relax. She felt a peace wash over her. She felt those little barbs of grief that were pricking and gnawing at her. She no longer felt the sharpness. And she knew then what she must do. When he finished, she smiled at him for the first time. She'd smiled in days. She thanked Lord Buddha for his time, love, and wisdom. She got up and she knelt down and she picked up the body of her little boy. And she smiled at Lord Buddha again. And then she turned, ducked under the low entrance of the hut, and made her way home to prepare for her little boy's funeral.